A society riddled with debt is a society that is reluctant or unable to spend, and a lot of that debt is now finding its way into housing with mortgages higher than ever. That's money that we're going to use to pay off our home loan that we could be using to keep the economy moving. In short, it is slowing the speed at which money circulates. So how do we fix it? The answer is to get rid of the debt. And Steve Keen has a cunning plan, a monetary reset. How would it work? We'll explore more on today's Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So Steve Keen has been talking about a debt moratorium for some time now. Now it's the debt reset, but I think the idea is pretty much the same. Pay everyone money to bring down their level of debt, and so it's fair and equitable. Pay money to everybody who doesn't have debt as well. Now, we didn't have time to look at the mechanics of this when we were looking at Steve's housing policy for the New Liberals, or whatever they're now called, the NLs. I'm not sure they're allowed to be called the New Liberals, but anyway. But look, the assumption is, Steve, I'm in debt. Say I've got a housing loan of $1 million. I get $100,000 to reduce that loan, so I now owe $900,000. How does that help the economy, Steve?
Well, a whole lot of ways, because what we've allowed to have happen is far too much money be created as credit-based money, and that money, rather than being used to create real resources, has been used to drive up asset prices. And so, if you look at if you look at British data, or you look at Australian data or American data, so pretty much from 1990 on, all the money that's been created by the private banking sector has been to drive up house prices. That's what it's actually done. So what we had was massively overvalued houses coming out of it, with a massively indebted household sector. And one of the side effects of the household sector being as indebted as they are now is you look and think, oh, I better save some money. So what I'm going to do is spend more slowly. And therefore, yes, okay, more money will turn up in my account. But gee, it's strange, my income seems to be falling as well. And what we're doing is actually causing, because of the high level of private debt, the response to that is to slow down how fast we spend. That reduces the velocity of circulation of money, and GDP falls as a result of us trying to save more money individually. So you've got a whole lot of traps out of this too much private debt.
So that 100,000 that I've suddenly got, I mean, that we should see the multiplier effect kick in. I spend that money on something, buying something. I pay someone.
No, you
for
don't.
That. I would have thought that would be the benefit, wouldn't it? That I've freed up some money that I can spend in the broader economy.
Because one of the dangers is that if you actually did that, you look at Australia had an example of this back in the 2008 financial crisis, when I think some bastard called Steve Keen scared the Prime Minister into a huge stimulus package back in those days.
It probably was your fault. You have a lot to answer for, don't you? Everything you're complaining about now, yes, you might be the man behind it all.
Yeah, they'll come back and bit me. But anyway, the one of the things the Rudd government did in its stimulus package was give everybody, I think it was $940. It wasn't actually quite $1,000. But anybody who'd paid their tax return that year got effectively $1,000, but they call it a tax rebate. Now, what it meant was $1,000 in your bank account. And where did most of that money go? Flat screen TVs bought through Harvey Norman.
Yeah.
Okay? So people just basically went out and spent the money straight away. So the government-created money came in, and rather than reducing debt levels, people did some of that, but predominantly they used it to spend more. Now, I'm not complaining about the lack of purchases of flat screen TVs. What I'm complaining about is far too much private debt, and you want to reduce that. Right. So the idea of this monetary reset, as we're calling it, is that everybody would get an identical amount of money. The target would be, and it wouldn't be done on a single day. This is the sort of thing you do gradually, and you might test with a small amount initially to see how it works. But you give the money to everybody on an equal basis. Those who have debt, their debt has to be paid down. Those who have no debt or less debt than the amount of money that comes through the monetary reset could be required by the reset, and I'm still working out whether we do this or not, could be required to buy bonds. Government bonds.
Okay, well, let's go on to that bond issue in a second. So, but the reason for bringing my debt down, presumably, okay, I mean, I can't spend 100,000, but I've got less repayments now to my bank, so I am freeing up a bit more money, which I can now spend in the economy, and hopefully I'll pay off my mortgage faster as well. So there's less money being tied up attached to that asset of my house, because I'm going to pay it off that bit quicker. So that's going to help the economy grow, presumably.
That does. I mean, this is when I stimulate this and using Minsky to do it, what I get is a boost to the economy because, again, what you're doing is you're creating money equally across the whole of society. And what that means is, and just in a very simple little model that I've done with basically the government sector, non-bank financial sector, and a non-bank economy sector of the economy, and the bank section of the economy, because the bank spends more slowly on the real economy than we ourselves do. By simply redistributing the amount of money, you actually get an increase in spending, and that's you get a necessary boost to GDP because if you're giving equally to everybody, there will be more people who are renters getting that money who'll spend it more rapidly. If the money gets redistributed, so it's more in the hand of renters than it is in landlords, then you'll get a boost to economic activity out of it. And that's what turns up in the simulations. If it was an unintended side effect, because the main thing is that let's reduce the amount of debt-based money and increase the amount of fiat-based money because it was a mistake to allow banks to create this much debt money in the first place.
So this is being paid for, obviously, by the government. So each of these 100,000, which sounds like an awful lot of money for the government to pay, and if you're not across MMT, you'd be going, oh my goodness, just think of all that government debt that would be incurred through this. But you're seeing it being covered pretty much the same way that governments have operated during the pandemic, in that they issue bonds. The intention is the RBA, or whichever country you're talking about, their central bank, buys up those bonds. It gets added to the central bank balance sheet. So it is increasing the money supply, isn't it, by going through that process?
No, it's not. No, it's not. If you require people who have debt to pay their debt down, then and those who don't have debt have to buy government bonds, then that also doesn't increase the money supply. So it's possible to do a monetary reset in such a way that there's no change in the amount of money in circulation in the economy.
Right. So the only people who are losing out in that scenario are the banks that have issued those mortgages, because they've all of a sudden... This
is where bonds come in. And this again, once you start thinking in the accounting sense that Minsky forces me into, and that modern monetary theory is also doing the same sort of thing, you get a very different perspective on what's the role of government bonds. Because let's just take a simple example of government running a deficit. When a government runs a deficit, it puts money in people's private bank accounts, and it puts there's exactly the same number in the reserve account system that private banks have. So let's say the government runs a deficit of $1 billion, this is a small number, £1 billion, then there's £1 billion increase in people's deposit accounts, and there's £1 billion increase in the reserve assets of the banking sector. Now, when you think about it, because you and I get a benefit out of that, we get money in our pocket, we can go and spend, and what we do when spending, I put money in Phil Dobbie's account, he puts money in mine, or we both put money in Rhodes' account to buy a new microphone and a new pair of headphones. That sort of thing is a positive for the non-bank sector. But what's in it for the banks? And the answer is nothing, because the increase in reserves they get out of the deficit don't earn them any income, and they can't trade reserves. So when the government says, we're now going to offer you bonds, sell bonds to the banks, through what they call the primary dealers in America, and the general bank sector elsewhere, they say, well, would you like to swap that £1 billion of reserves we've created for you for £1 billion worth of bonds, which will be paying, let's say, 5% interest? Let's be realistic. Back in the old days when it actually happened, let's say 3% interest, paying 3% interest. So you're going to get $30 million a year out of them. And you can trade them, buy and sell them, and make capital gains out of them. We'll occasionally buy them off you and sell them back and so on. And every time we do that, you're going to come out ahead. So the banks say, oh, yes, please. So here's the $1 billion in reserves you've created for us. Now give us $1 billion worth of bonds and pay us 3% interest on that. So what that is doing is effectively giving the banks a 3% rate of return on the money that's created for the non-bank sector by the increase in their deposits out of the deficit.
Right. So where does that 3% come on? Because this is where people go, oh, hang on a second, this is government debt that's got to be paid, and that's exactly what they're talking about. Obviously,
and the thing is, if you, and I've done the modelling of this in Minsky as well, which I'll happily share for this particular podcast. But there's two ways you can go about it. The simple way is that the government would be saying, we're going to pay 3% interest on these bonds. So we're going to go, the Treasury goes and borrows 30 billion, it was having created $1 billion in government money that's gone into people's bank accounts and reserves as well. They then sell £1 billion worth of bonds. So the liability the Treasury now has is for these bonds, and they've got to pay interest on those bonds. Well, they simply say, we're going to borrow that $30 million a year, we'll borrow from the central bank. So the Treasury gets in debt to the central bank. Now, I've had people on my YouTube channel come along and challenge, neoclassical economists, of course, challenge me, say, that's not legally possible. The Treasury can't borrow from the central bank. And I said, well, what they do is they issue more bonds, and so long as the central bank buys that fraction of bonds, the government debt doesn't explode. So if you have a deficit of $1 billion pounds, and you then have a 3% rate of return on that, which means you've got to pay £30 million per year, then if in the buying and selling that Treasury's, the central bank is always doing with the banks itself or the on the bond market, if the central bank buys 3% of that, so $30 million a year, then the interest doesn't compound itself and doesn't explode. So that's a necessary role for the central bank to stop the money supply exploding and to stop an inflationary surge, is to buy bonds issued by the Treasury, sold to the private banks, equivalent to the rate of interest on the bonds that were used to transfer the deficit funding from reserves to bonds.
Right. Now, I might be being a bit slow here then. So the bonds that are issued to cover these, the paying off of these loans, ultimately are sitting with the commercial banks, or they're being bought up?
Sitting with the Treasury, sitting with the central bank.
Sitting with the, right. Okay. So it is just like QE in effect then, isn't it, really? And then
not the QE is actually buying off the that's the QE is the reserve, the central bank buying off the private banks or buying off the shadow banking sector. But this would be the central bank in its regular operations with the private banks buying bonds equivalent to the interest on the bonds that were used to finance the deficit.
Right. What's called, it, often with a swear word attached, monetizing of debt, which is seen as a bad thing by in some circles. But you're saying no, that should be perfectly normal behavior.
It's part of the sensible operations of a fiat monetary system. But it
does keep on adding to the balance sheet of the central bank. There's not that I'm saying there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but everyone gets scared if they see it going up, and everyone starts talking about the need to bring it down.
Well, but that's trivial. When the QE stuff is what's caused the huge increases. So QE is a totally different story. QE is what they call non-standard monetary policy. The standard monetary policy is if the central bank is buying roughly net buying over a year, bonds equivalent to the interest on the bonds that have been issued to cover the deficit for that year, then you'll get a very slow rate of increase in the balance sheet of the central bank. But that will mean that you effectively neutralize the inflationary potential of paying interest on those bonds.
Mm. Interesting, isn't it, that everyone's talking about central banks trying to reduce that balance sheet. It's interesting that, and the reason for that is because everyone's worried that it's too much money and that money supply causes inflation. But
there's not enough money.
Well, but it's bizarre, isn't it? Because even Jerome Powell has said that's rubbish. That last year was saying that, the inflation just comes from imbalances between supply and demand in the real economy. It's nothing to do with monetary aggregates. So if that's the case, why are they trying to reduce the Fed balance sheet?
Yeah, they should just live with it. I mean, It's one of these side effects. Well, the reason they've been forced to have this ridiculous increase in the balance sheets is being run by neoclassical economists. They didn't see a financial crisis coming. They ignored the levels of private debt, and then they got involved in trying to rescue the only way they could do, which is by injecting money into the reserve accounts of banks and then into the bank accounts of the non-bank sector when they bought bonds off non-bank financial institutions. So it's all, it's a consequence of their own bad management that QE had to happen in the first place.
Let me ask you a question and then give you the answer and see if it's the right one.
Okay.
If you are taking money out of the finance sector and it's increasing consumption, then that's going to cause inflation, isn't it? My answer is, well, maybe that's not a bad thing, because if you think about before the pandemic, we were worried about a lack of inflation, and we need a small amount, and this is probably only going to create a small amount of inflation.
No, the QE doesn't actually have QE.
Not the QE,
QE
not the QE component of it. The fact that I'm paying off my loan that much faster, and so I'm starting to take money out and spend it in the real world. That's going to increase consumption. If you increase consumption, then you're going to get a bit of inflation as a consequence.
Potentially, what inflation, and this is actually, if you look back at Bill Phillips's work on this front, he was focusing really on inflation being an income distribution thing, not something driven by the amount of money being created, but being driven by a struggle over the distribution of income between workers and capitalists, and also between raw material producers and manufacturers. And if you had a booming economy, which we had back at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, a booming economy, a strong and organised working class with trade unions, and mineral producers who suddenly had muscle because there was such a level of demand for oil at the time, then when they said we're not going to continue working unless you get us a 10% wage increase, and the mineral producers saying we're not going to sell you the oil unless you pay us 4 times as much per barrel, then in that situation the prices would go up, and the effect of the prices going up would be that the corporations who are paying these higher prices would extend their lines of credit to the banking sector, and that would cause the money supply to rise. So it's the reverse of the causation, where you think the money supply causes the rise in prices. It's the rise in prices causing the rise in the money supply.
Now, I don't have debts. The money is given to me in bonds. So
Yep.
I am not offsetting a debt now. So does that make this new money? I'm trying to figure this out.
No, it doesn't make it new money. It actually means that when you get the money, like everybody gets 100,000. Let's use a flat number just to make it easy, and that's not too far from what I've actually considered being necessary, because you actually are trying to reduce the level of household debt by about 100% of GDP, because taking Australia as an example, it's currently 120% of GDP, and it's 6 times what it should be. So bring it down 100% of GDP. Now, so you have 100,000 per adult, and if the adults are in debt, then they must pay their debt down, so their debt falls rather than the amount of money they've got rising. For those who aren't in debt, then they get 100,000. Now, you could require, and this is to neutralize the impact on the money supply, you could require that 100,000 be used to buy bonds off the banking sector. So the banking sector is the first purchaser of what you call monetary reset bonds. They buy them equivalent to the amount of money being created by the whole monetary reset. And then they sell the fraction of those bonds to the people who didn't have debt, or didn't have his debt equivalent to the reset level. And that therefore means the money supply falls, okay? Because your deposits go down, your private holdings of bonds rise. So what you get out of it, let's say you had no debt at all, you get $100,000 worth of government bonds yielding 3%. Now, that's the start of it. You could then say, and this is also stuff I have to work out, there'd be a lot of landlords who aren't going to do very well out of this. And I'm really sorry for them. I'll happily know how to play the violin to show how sad I am. So they're going to want to sell their places, and they may well want to be selling them to people who are currently renting, because the farce of the last 40 years is all these government schemes to promote home ownership have reduced home ownership, increased people on renting, locked out the youth. So the idea is to make it possible for the youth to get back into the market, and these bonds might well be the way to do that, because there'll be a lot of landlords who aren't going to make capital gain anymore. They're going to have to liquidate their houses, and they might want to sell them to renters.
Yeah, I don't think it's just those schemes, is it? I mean, house prices around the world, without the government helping, seem to be on the increase anyway, don't they? Because asset prices are rising as people look for places to put their money. But if yep. Let's take it through the step by step then, just so we're all clear. I don't have a debt. So the government has got $100,000, which is earmarked for me. It's issued that, and it's been issued as bonds, which banks buy up. Now the banks, aren't they? You're saying they transfer the money from the reserves to buy those bonds. So they're transferring reserves money for bonds. The bank can't then sell me the bonds, can they? Because that's
yes, they can. Yes, they can, and they do all the time.
But that's dipping money out. That's taking money out of their reserves. I thought they weren't able to do that.
No, they're not taking out of reserves. If the government sells bonds to individuals, then the bond holdings of the banks go down, the reserve holdings go up.
Right. Okay. So
if the banks have bought bonds off the government, so they've got treasury bonds, which is sitting as an asset in the banking sector, and they sell those bonds to the public.
Oh, then you get the cash, and then the cash goes back into.
Yeah. Then if the bonds fall, then so do the deposits.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So it's the same thing as paying debt down. So there's no change in the reserves in that situation. There is a fall in the ownership of bonds by the banking sector, and there's a fall in the deposit liabilities the banking sector has towards the public.
Right. Makes sense. It's complicated, isn't it? But
this is why I built Minsky, because I couldn't work this up out of my head without having Minsky as a guide. And that's why I'm for Christ's sake, I want more non-orthodox economists download it and start using it, because everything you verbalize in modern monetary theory, you can explain using Minsky, and the logic is far clearer.
Now, I've got bonds now. I didn't have debts. Now I'm holding government bonds. So I'm getting paid interest on those bonds. It's almost like a reverse tax, isn't it, from the government? You haven't got a housing loan, so we're actually going to pay you money rather than tax you. But where's that money coming from to pay for that interest on those?
Well, again, that comes from the Treasury.
So it comes from the Treasury, and then they monetize it by having it covered by bonds which are bought by the central bank.
The central bank buys the bonds equivalent to that off the private banks, because they're required to, because the central bank can't lend directly to the Treasury. Then it's got to be this roundabout route that has exactly the same outcome as if the Treasury was borrowing off the central bank. And of course, since the Treasury owns the central bank, you can borrow off as much as they like and pay zero interest on it.
So you've said in your paper, which is a heavy read for the average Australian voter, I might suggest. But you list the benefits: a dramatic and necessary fall in the indebtedness of the Australian public, well, because they're going to owe 100,000 less. And the benefits of that are just that they are going to be in a position to spend more at some point. Well, give me again, because everyone seems to be getting by, don't they? I mean, even though we are heavily indebted, all around the world we're heavily indebted, and yet there were some figures I saw for the UK, actually, which I was going to use on the podcast last week, which I didn't. So let me just find it. The proportion of people who I can't find it in a hurry, but basically the proportion of people who felt like they, even though the the level of debt has gone up. Here we are. The proportion of people who say that they have a heavy burden of financial debt in the UK has fallen from 20% of households in 2010 to 14% by 2020. 56% are saying it's no problem at all. So even though we're all in more debt because we've got bigger housing loans, the proportion of people who are saying that they have a heavy burden from this financial debt has actually fallen quite a bit. So which sort of doesn't tally with the numbers. I'm just wondering, assuming it'd be the same in many other Western countries, and perhaps it is in Australia. So, because I know lots of people who've got massive mortgages, huge houses, but still somehow manage to be getting by.
Yeah, well, if you look at the velocity of money figures, I always prefer to look at the aggregate data. And that's where the American data is so useful, even though they've stopped showing quite a few of the series. There's been a general plunge in the velocity of circulation of money from, I think, a high of about 3.5 times per year back during the Volcker inflation period, two times per year before then. So 2 looks like about 1.8 to 2 looked like the sort of sustainable level for monetary turnover in America before we started getting into this period of financialization. But now we're down below 1. So what you have is, and then the rate of growth of the economy has been slowing down as well. This also turns up in my Minsky model of rising levels of debt cause a decline in the rate of economic growth. So you have all these things which are constraining the economy, and meaning we spend our time talking about financial bloody manipulations rather than innovation, capitalist innovation. So that's the other thing I see to be particularly negative about the world we're in. We are all talking about how to financialize things, not how to innovate. And that's undermining the one strength that capitalism has over other social systems.
Right, but how does paying off this debt, so I've got 100,000 less in my mortgage, how is that directly relating to innovation?
Well, a lot of it is because it doesn't directly relate to it, but you cease selling money or giving money to people to speculate on house prices, make that no longer a profitable line of bank business. If you want to be profit as a bank, you've got to provide working capital to corporations. You have to find some way of financing entrepreneurs, make banking creative once more, rather than becoming the brain-dead nonsense it's doing of just financing asset bubbles.
So you say another benefit is going to be a matching increase in the public's financial equity. The pressure to speculate to achieve financial security for your future is substantially reduced. I mean, that might be seen in some circles as a bit naive, because people will always speculate, won't they? When they, irrespective, there's never enough. People will.
Well, no, like if you look at the 50s and 60s, I mean, people were doing it slowly in the 50s and 60s, but the real speculation was really pushed by the financial sector onto the rest of the economy. Because if you have a substantial amount of money coming in for your income alone, if you have the government spending, creating more aggregate savings for you over time, so your bank account is rising, you're not feeling vulnerable. You don't think, oh God, I've got to find some way to get an extra gain. I might go and buy that non-financial asset and see if its price rises and then lever myself up. This whole speculative mindset has really only started coming in since the 1970s. It's not something that was commonplace in the household sector before we went to this period of neoliberal dominance of the economic policy and letting the banks do what they damn well like. So I really do think if we could restore the level of government money creation that occurred in the 50s and 60s, we would have less motivation to speculate, because that government money creation alone would put the household sector in positive equity. And the thing which really motivates you to speculate is the feeling you're going into a negative equity, and you've got to get yourself out of it. And what can I do? I can buy a share, or I can buy Bitcoin and watch its price rise.
So there's the danger, though, if you in effect bail people out, so they're getting their debts down. Could you sort of repeat the behaviour that we saw in banks, that people become less risk adverse because they're being bailed out? I mean, maybe they could do the opposite, and people start going, well, look, we got bailed out with 100,000. They're going to do it again. Let's just speculate more.
Well, that's one reason why I want to cut out the growth of asset prices that comes out of rising debt levels. Because at the moment, there's a positive, an amplifying, I hate the word positive because it's misinterpreted so much, an amplifying feedback between rising levels of new household debt and rising levels of share prices and rising levels of house prices. So I want to end that by, I'd prefer to abolish margin debt altogether. So you're going to buy shares, you buy it with your own money, because margin debt's been, I think, a classic net negative on its social benefit over time. So no more margin debt. I'd quite happily legislate against that. But in terms of household debt, limit the amount of borrowing that can be done to buy a property to a multiple of the rental income of the property, whether that's actual or imputed rental. And my target would be half what it is now. The ratio of, and certainly in Australia, of house mortgage to house rental income is about 20 to 1. It should be about 10 to 1. And if you get to that point, you would then have houses being advertised for sale, and you'd have the actual or imputed rent for the house. So the rent was $1,000 a week, or $50,000 a year. Then the maximum you could borrow, and this could be actually published on the real estate ad, would be $500,000.
But the reason why everyone is investing in all of this and speculating is because they're shit scared about their pension, isn't it? It's like how
exactly.
we're all living.
The other thing, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
so aren't you inhibiting their ability to do that? And they're going to go, bloody Steve Keen. Here we are now. He's stopped the growth in houses. He's now wanting to stop investment in borrowing to invest in shares. How the hell do I make sure I've got enough money to live off in my old age?
You get a decent pension again. Because, again, one of these undermining of the pension system and trying to get it off the books of the government was all this driven by this fantasy the government should be running a surplus. So, again, this thing is put in a whole set of traps. If you had a decent pension, you're
talking about a decent state pension. So rather than private pension schemes, the
state pension, which a lot of the Nordic countries still have that. It's quite a substantial. It's certainly more than 25% of your salary. between up to 50% of your last 5 years' salary becomes your pension level. And that's one of the ways the government should create money, because we have people who no longer are able to work. They're too old to work. And particularly thinking of people in manual jobs who don't want to work past 65, you're getting arthritis. Why do you want to be on a production line? At that age, the state should then say, okay, we're going to provide a decent standard of living for you. You want not the same as you got paid for a wage, but you haven't got the costs of going out to get labour working either. You would have saved some money over the previous 40 years of your working life. Here's a pension worth, say, half what your, so a minimum level, so you don't get caught up in poverty traps because you're in a low wage situation to begin with. So some minimal standard of living, and then with some rising amount if you're a higher wage earner during your working life. And that's the state creating money, because these people simply can't work anymore. We shouldn't require them to work. So that, yes, restore the pension system as well. Getting rid of pensions was another neoliberal piece of garbage that's tied up with a whole property bubble we've had as well. I mean, the extent to which we've stuffed up what was a fairly well-functioning capitalist economy 40 or 50 years ago is quite breathtaking.
Yeah, in the days of the mixed economy. I mean, we should just start talking about that again, shouldn't we? Yeah. So look, Steve, all of this seems a bit radical for one term of government, but even if you just get people talking, because the one thing I think is one belief that is shared amongst everybody in economics, in politics, across all walks of life, is the way things are right now is not right. We might all have different ideas about how we fix it, but I think there's a universal belief that things aren't going right, and change is needed, and we just need to figure out amongst ourselves which is the way forward. So, I mean, the time is right, isn't it?
The time is right. I mean, we won't get into office this time round, but I'll get a chance to, when I get into the Senate, let's take a positive spin here. When I get into the Senate, I will harangue on this particular point, and at least the newspaper will be forced to cover it, whereas at the moment, this doesn't get out of the netherworlds of strange podcasts.
Oh, thanks for that. We'll catch you again soon.
It's Laurel and Hardy, mate. We're a joint back to you.
We'll catch you again soon. Thanks, Steve.
Hey, mate. Bye-bye.
Well, we'll be back with another strange podcast next week. Thanks for listening.